There's a moment in every young player's season that doesn't look dramatic on paper, but quietly shapes everything that follows. For Alex Eala, this next stretch might be exactly that moment. Not a final, not a headline-grabbing upset, just a return. Because as she sets her sights on the Italian Open, the real question isn't whether she can win a few matches in Rome. It's whether the pieces of her game, technical, tactical, and mental, are finally aligning in a way that can sustain a climb, not just spark one. And if you've followed her trajectory closely, you'll know why that question matters now more than ever. Earlier in the season, there were flashes. Not just of talent, we've known about that for years, but of structure. Matches where her patterns made sense, where her point construction held up under pressure. But those glimpses came with interruptions, breaks in rhythm, small dips in execution, moments where matches slipped not because of a lack of ability, but because of timing. That's where this return becomes interesting. Clay, especially European clay, has a way of exposing incomplete games. It slows things down just enough to ask tougher questions. Can you build points patiently? Can you defend without drifting too far behind the baseline? Can you recognize when to change direction, not just hit harder? For Eala, those aren't theoretical challenges. They sit right at the center of her development. Her left-handed forehand remains her clearest weapon. It's naturally heavy, with shape that pushes opponents off the court, particularly into the ad side. On clay, that shot becomes even more effective, not because it gets faster, but because it gains time to work. The bounce rises, the angles widen, and suddenly opponents are hitting from uncomfortable positions more often than they'd like. But here's the nuance that often gets overlooked. The forehand alone doesn't dictate matches at this level. What matters is what comes after it. In her best stretches, Eala uses that forehand not as a finishing shot, but as a starting point. She opens the court, then looks to redirect with her backhand down the line. That two-step pattern, forehand cross-court to create space, backhand down the line to take control, is where her game begins to look complete. The challenge is consistency. There have been matches where that pattern appears early, works effectively, and then fades. Not because opponents solve it completely, but because the timing drops just slightly. A forehand lands shorter. A backhand arrives a fraction late. At this level, those margins are enough to flip momentum. This is where Rome becomes more than just another tournament. The Rome conditions, slower clay, heavier air compared to Madrid, tend to reward players who commit to patterns over time. It's not about quick points. It's about accumulation. You win a rally, then another, not through sudden brilliance, but through sustained pressure. That environment could suit Eala if she leans into it. Because one of the more subtle improvements in her game over the past year has been her willingness to construct points with patience. Earlier in her development, there were moments where she would go for too much too soon, pulling the trigger down the line without fully opening the court. Recently, there's been a shift. More margin. More shape. A better understanding of when to accelerate and when to hold. Still, there's a second layer to this, and it might be the most important one. Her positioning. Watch closely during longer rallies, and you'll notice a pattern. When Eala is confident, she holds her ground near the baseline. She takes the ball early, particularly on the backhand side, and redirects with purpose. But under pressure, she can drift. A step back becomes two. Suddenly, she's defending from a position that limits her options. On clay, that tendency can become amplified. The surface invites players to retreat, to buy time. But the best clay court players know when to resist that instinct. They absorb, yes, but they also step in at the right moment, cutting off angles before rallies spiral out of control. For Eala, the Italian Open will test that balance. Can she defend without conceding too much court? Can she transition from defense to offense in a single shot, rather than resetting the rally entirely? These are the small details that separate competitive matches from winning ones. And then there's the serve, often the quiet barometer of a player's confidence. Eala's serve isn't built on sheer power, but it has improved in placement and variation. The wide serve on the ad side, especially as a left-hander, can open immediate space. On clay, that space doesn't always translate into outright winners, but it sets up the first shot of the rally, the one that matters most. The key is first serve percentage. In matches where that number holds steady, her service games become manageable. She starts rallies on her terms, even if only slightly. But when the percentage drops, the pressure shifts quickly. Second serves sit up just enough for aggressive returners to step in, and suddenly she's defending before the point even develops. That's where mental composure becomes visible, not in big reactions, but in small resets. One of the more encouraging signs in Eala's recent matches has been her ability to stay engaged after missed opportunities. There was a time when a few errors in a row would lead to rushed decisions. Now, there's more structure in how she responds. A missed backhand down the line is followed by a higher margin rally ball, not another immediate risk. That evolution matters, especially in a tournament like Rome. Because matches here rarely follow a straight line. Breaks of serve are common. Momentum shifts happen. The players who come through are usually the ones who accept that rhythm, rather than fight it. And this brings us back to the bigger picture. Eala isn't arriving in Rome as a favorite, and that's not a disadvantage. It gives her room to build, to test patterns without the weight of expectation. But it also places the focus where it should be, on development within competition. If she wins a tight 3-set match by adjusting her return position midway through, that's progress. If she loses but sustains her aggressive court positioning against a higher-ranked opponent, that's information. These are the layers that don't show up in headlines but shape rankings over time. There's also a broader context to consider. The WTA field, particularly on clay, has become increasingly demanding in terms of physical and tactical versatility. Players aren't just defending well, they're countering with precision. Angles come back sharper. Short balls are punished more consistently. That environment forces young players to refine their games quickly. Eala's left-handed profile gives her a natural edge in certain matchups, especially against right-handers who struggle with high-bouncing forehands into their backhand wing. But relying on that alone isn't enough. The next step is layering that advantage with decision-making, knowing when to extend rallies, when to shorten them, and when to change direction under pressure. Rome offers a clear stage for that process. And there's one more element that often goes unnoticed: scheduling rhythm. Returning to action isn't just about physical readiness. It's about timing, how quickly a player re-enters the competitive pace of matches. Practice sets can simulate intensity, but they rarely replicate the unpredictability of match play. The first round in a tournament like the Italian Open often feels like a recalibration. Timing on returns. Adjusting to different ball trajectories. Reading opponents in real time rather than from scouting reports. For Eala, that first match could be the most revealing, not because of the result, but because of how quickly she settles into those details. Does she find her forehand depth early? Does her backhand hold up cross-court without leaking errors? Does she commit to her patterns even when points extend longer than expected? These are the quiet indicators analysts watch for. Because once those pieces fall into place, something shifts. Matches stop feeling reactive. They become intentional. And that's ultimately where Eala's development is heading, not toward isolated wins, but toward repeatable performance. There's a difference. A single good result can come from form, confidence, or even matchup dynamics. But sustained progress comes from patterns that hold under different conditions, against different opponents, across multiple tournaments. That's the standard she's moving toward. The Italian Open, in that sense, is less about breakthrough and more about confirmation. Confirmation that the adjustments we've seen in parts of her season can hold together over a full match, then another, then another. And if they do, the implications extend beyond Rome. Because the clay season doesn't end here. It builds. Each tournament feeds into the next, culminating in events where physical endurance, tactical clarity, and mental stability are tested over longer formats and higher stakes. If Eala can use Rome to stabilize her baseline positioning, trust her forehand patterns, and maintain her composure through momentum swings, she sets herself up not just for one tournament, but for the stretch that follows. That's how rankings move, not in leaps, but in layers. So when she steps onto the court in Rome, the focus shouldn't just be on the scoreboard. It should be on the details that sit underneath it. The footwork adjustment before a backhand. The decision to go cross-court one more time before changing direction. The choice to step inside the baseline rather than retreat. Those are the moments where matches are shaped long before they're decided. And for a player like Alex Eala, still building the foundation of her professional career, those moments matter more than any single result. Because if you look closely, you can already see the outlines of what her game could become. A left-hander who controls rallies with shape and variation. A player who uses angles not just to win points, but to construct them. Someone who understands that patience isn't passive, it's strategic. The question now is whether those outlines can hold under the specific pressures of tour-level competition in a setting like the Italian Open, where every point asks a little more of your decision-making. We'll get part of that answer soon enough. But as with most things in tennis, the real story won't be in the obvious moments. It will be in the patterns that repeat, the adjustments that stick, and the choices that reveal how a player sees the court when the margin for error gets just a little bit smaller. That's where this return becomes meaningful. Not as a headline, but as a step that, if taken correctly, quietly changes the direction of everything that follows.